Please welcome to the stage the Director of the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, Merit Turetsky.
Happy Sunday. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Merit Turetsky, and I am the Director of INSTAR, or the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, here at CU Boulder. Welcome to one of the final events of the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit, which is this incredible panel on traditional knowledge and climate solutions. As the oldest institute on this campus, INSTAR has a long history of responding to pressing environmental issues and abrupt change. Much of our past scholarship has been rooted in traditional, often colonial Western science. Today, however, we seek to build change. We are aiming to create change fundamentally in research by amplifying and valuing use-inspired and participatory designs. We want this research to be based on relationships, trust, and equity. We work on native lands and unceded territories around the world where we rely upon, benefit from, and learn from traditional knowledge based on the landscape and time immemorial. Integrating multiple ways of knowing into climate solutions is essential, but it will require fundamentally changing how research is funded, conducted, and disseminated. This is at the core of INSTAR's mission. Please consider becoming part of this mission and becoming part of our change. One way is to sign up for our electronic newsletter, which provides opportunities for engagement on a variety of local environmental issues, regional and global environmental issues, and climate solutions. To sign up, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/INSTAR, INSTAAR. Today, we are here to listen and learn from some incredible minds and experiences. Today's panel will explore how traditional knowledge can and should be brought to bear, along with Western science and technology, in developing sustainable, deployable climate change solutions. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's session moderator. Tristan Atone is a member of the Kiowa tribe and an editor-at-large at GRIST. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, Indian Country Today, and NPR, just to name a few. Atone's stories have won multiple awards, including a George Polk Award, a National Magazine Award nomination, and investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors. A past president of the Native American Journalists Association, Atone is a 2017 Nieman Fellow. Thank you, Tristan. Welcome to the stage, and thanks to all of our panelists today. Please join me.
Thank you for that introduction. The notion that indigenous peoples are experts on the landscapes that they caretake would be hard to dispute. Indigenous communities carry with them centuries of observations, analysis, and knowledge of how the environment has laid the foundation for coexistence, survival, and continuation. This body of expertise, generally known as traditional ecological knowledge, can broadly be defined as a system of observations, practices, and beliefs that promote environmental sustainability through better relationships between humans and the environment. And it seems to be all the rage these days. We're here right now because scientists and governments are turning to indigenous communities for answers to the climate crisis. For instance, last year, the Biden administration issued a memorandum that committed to elevating traditional ecological knowledge in federal scientific and policy processes. But reliance strictly on traditional ecological knowledge as a solution to the rapidly intensifying climate crisis risks segregating indigenous science from land tenure rights, political recognition, and human rights instruments, converting thousands of years of expertise into yet another resource that can be exploited by settlers, non-indigenous societies, and states. How do we square policies that recognize the value of practices like indigenous-controlled burns, but also fail to protect those same communities from the fragmenting of nearby lands and interconnected ecosystems by the construction of dams, mines, roads, and tourism infrastructure? Why are indigenous peoples consulted by governments to better understand changing ecosystem conditions, but have their competence challenged in court when extractive industries threaten their ability to live on and with that land? Study after study has found that biodiversity degradation is significantly less where indigenous peoples manage land and resources. However, traditional ecological knowledge continues to be separated from the effective political participation of indigenous peoples in decision-making over their lands and resources. This includes the support of self-determination, the return of lands taken by settler states, and the exercise of free, prior, and informed consent. Our panel today is going to dive deeper into these ideas, and we're joined by Christina Koch. Christina is a founder and program director of the Julian Cho Society, which is dedicated to the conservation of the environment and rights of indigenous peoples of southern Belize. She is also an organizer and co-spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance. Koch and other leaders have worked with lawyers from the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Institute at the University of Arizona to negotiate with the government of Belize and build capacity among local Maya. Tia Kennedy is an indigenous rights activist and youth leader and carries Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe teachings from Oneida Nation and the Thames and Walpole Island First Nation. A future Rising Fellow at Girl Rising and the founder of GNU Kwe Consulting, a company that promotes meaningful and effective interactions with indigenous peoples, Kennedy focuses on a community-based and heart-centered approach to climate and racial justice. Michael Katutua Johnson is a member of the Hopi tribe and an assistant specialist with the University of Arizona within the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. Johnson is a co-author on the Indigenous chapter in the 5th National Climate Assessment and continues to practice Hopi dry farming at his home in northern Arizona, and also winning Best Dressed Award for the day.
Thank you.
And we're joined online via Zoom. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, a distinguished teaching professor of environmental biology at SUNY, founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, and author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. We will be taking questions during the panel, but please be aware you'll need to submit those through the app, and I will do my best to get through as many as I can as they come in. So to begin, I'd like to briefly turn to our panelists to talk more about their work. Maybe starting, Michael, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you do and how your work fits into this conversation, and same question to the rest of the panelists as we go by.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Michael Katutua Johnson. I'm a 250th generation Hopi farmer. That beats people in Iowa by about maybe 175 or so. Yeah, I'm a faculty member. I'm an assistant specialist at the University of Arizona for the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, but I'm also an affiliate member with the Indigenous Resiliency Center that focuses on food, energy, and water. And so that's a little bit about myself. But like I said, I'm more proud myself on just being a farmer, you know, before all this academic accolades and stuff like that. But thank you very much.
Hi, Sagoli Sagwe, Tia Niuget, Spuju, Ganokwe, Nishnakas, Main Gendoram, Bekish Ganon Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Kwayandao. That's my traditional introduction in the language. My English name is Tia Kennedy. My spirit's name is the Golden Eagle Woman. I'm of the Wolf Clan, and I come from two First Nations communities, Oneida Nation of the Thames and Walpole Island First Nation. So I carry both Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe teachings. My pronouns are she and her. I identify as a woman. So that's all my introduction within my traditional language. But I also, in my Gen Z language, I just want to shout out to all the res kids out there that are doing really incredible work within our communities, that are revitalizing our languages, practicing their culture, and that are carrying the strength of our ancestors because, you know, they do really courageous and incredible work within our communities, and they're just as deserving to be on these stages too. I am a policy analyst, and I've been considered a climate activist. However, I just feel like I am a community member in Anishinaabe Kwe that has a responsibility to safeguard Mother Earth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am a Echimaya woman from southern Belize. It's an honor and a privilege to be here on ancestral lands of indigenous peoples from North America. My work, what I do, I am first and foremost an activist for indigenous peoples' land tenure rights. Over the last 30 years, my people and I have been working on securing and affirming the rights to our lands and resources in southern Belize through strategic litigation, advocacy, and community organizing. I am here in my capacity as the spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcaldes Association, which is an association of traditional leaders from 41 Maya villages in southern Belize. We occupy approximately 1 million acres of land, where we still have the most intact rainforest, the highest area for biodiversity, and where, in fact, we're saying that, you know, there's a wealth of traditional knowledge on that land that could meaningfully contribute to whatever is being designed or thought of in terms of our climate response. And so it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
And Robin, if you can hear us, same question to you, if you can talk a little bit more about your work.
Yeah. Ani bojo shabadaski gish kokwen nedeshnakas. Bodwe wadmi kwenda. Megazeta dam min wamako do dam. I am Robin Kimmer of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I bring you greetings and gratitude for the opportunity to be here with you. I'm so interested in hearing what everybody has to say from all the four directions here. So thank you, everyone, for joining. A brief introduction. I'm a botanist, a plant ecologist, and a professor of environmental and forest biology. I'm the director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, where I have the great privilege of working with an awesome team of folks with graduate students, staff, postdocs, and thinking about how it is that we use together selected tools of Western science guided by Indigenous worldview and philosophy. I'd say that one of the things that our group is most engaged in is ecological restoration, but really broadening the concept of restoration to reciprocal restoration, of thinking about the ways in which we heal our relationships to land and to one another at the same time as we're working to heal the land. We're super interested in the impacts of climate change on our cultural plants and the cultural impacts that has, and how we can adapt to that. So that's all I'll say for now. Again, with great gratitude and respect to you all. So glad to be with you.
So my hope is to have more of a conversation than sort of a straight sort of Q&A. And Robin, maybe I can throw this first question to you to get the conversation started. In the discussions around the adoption and use of traditional ecological knowledge, I'm curious, what are some of the things that you're not hearing in the conversation? Where are some areas that people should be talking a lot more about when it comes to TEK?
That's a really interesting formulation. Mostly I feel like I'm celebrating the fact that people are talking about TEK at all. I think that one of the things that is often on my mind is the ways in which, as our, let me say, our mainstream conservation counterparts get very excited about the empirical knowledge of TEK. There is a tendency for data, what I think of as mining of traditional knowledge, taking the pieces that fit a Western conception, but not fully engaging with indigenous worldview, philosophy, and values. And so I'm really interested in the ways that, particularly in response to impending climate catastrophe, that there's not this notion of just taking the pieces that fit the colonized worldview and using them for adaptation and mitigation, but to really think about how do we engage with indigenous values and the role that they have in reshaping our path toward a more livable future.
And Christina, I see you nodding to this as well. What are your thoughts?
Well, what is missing? I'd like to start by quoting a Maya elder and perhaps sum up what is missing. Here he says, our connection to the world as indigenous people and the cosmos are the basis of our action, our thoughts, and our sentiments in life and of life. And I think that what is missing really in all this conversation is that the basis of our existence and our knowledge and our ways of being and our ways of knowing is really rooted in our spirituality. And so if I ask scientists, right, how do you view science, right? What is the distinction? The distinction is that we see our knowledge and our wisdom as sacred. We see our knowledge and our wisdom as a part of our existence. And we don't see ourselves as experts. We see ourselves as stewards of this great and sacred wisdom. And so even from the angle and the approach, it's from a place of humility. It's from a place of seeing yourself and your existence as a part of a whole. And it challenges the hierarchies that have been constructed in every facet of our lives, right? From the time we start going to school and earning these degrees and earning these certificates because we become expertise in a particular area or a particular field. Whereas our schools and our source of knowledge is the land. And when you learn by doing, following your parents and acquiring this sacred wisdom and knowledge, you're not becoming better. You're becoming a part of. And so I think that is missing, the spiritual basis of our sacred wisdoms and knowledge.
Michael, when we were prepping for this panel a while back, you brought up a similar idea about talking about values and talking about that we can't be measuring traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge through numbers or figures at all. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those notions?
I think, I want to talk about real quick about the previous question. Robin is right about this. We look at the technology and we look at the practices and the processes, but we sure don't focus enough on the values. You know, I think we don't focus on those values. We don't even focus on the values of why we live in the world what we live in today. What caused those? It's a whole different set of values, right, between how indigenous people look at something and how Western people look at something. So that kind of tailors into the question that you asked me, is like, you know, what do we view as success as? You know, I mean, before I came to the University of Arizona, I worked for the Native American Agricultural Fund. And in our version of success and how we define success, not necessarily from them, but from my standpoint of view, is what impact does the community have? What is the community's vision of success? That often quite differs than what you would see in an academic institution or a philanthropic organization, where the rates of success are based upon the deliverables. You know, how much numbers do you have? You know, it goes beyond reasoning. And so if you really want to have impact, we really need to focus on what is the success of those communities? What does those communities want? How are they being impacted? Because their version of success are things like, oh, you know, we're successful because my grandparents are being taken care of. You know, it's that type of simple stuff that I think we're still missing. But I kind of want to just redefine, you know, how we look at success across the board, because you'll see impact if you look at the type of success I have rather than just the number thing. And so that's how, when I want to talk about looking at success, that's how I kind of phrase it, how we look at success.
And Tia, same for you. Is this, when you're thinking about success, does this give an opportunity to rethink how we're navigating like Western systems as indigenous people, how we're engaging with the world differently?
Definitely. I think how I've been told, you know, successful ecosystems will create successful economies and they'll create successful communities. And so I think we really do need to figure out, you know, how are we going to redefine this term of success? As humans, we're only part of this ecosystem, and so when we're defining that or redefining what success means, we need to be listening to all parts of the ecosystem and not just trying to define it ourselves. And when I think about that, I think about how Mother Earth and she measures success, and it takes me back to this story about the hummingbird and the hummingbird in the Great Fire, or how the hummingbird got his speed. And in this story, there's this big forest fire that breaks out, and, you know, all the animals are fleeing their homes, you know, the deer's there, the raccoon's there, even our big courageous bear is looking at this huge fire, and they're all saying, there's nothing we can do, you know, this fire's too big, we can't put this out. And so this hummingbird, he comes along and he says, you know, we can't just do anything, we have to try something. And they all kind of laughed at him. They said, oh, you're just so small, hummingbird, what can you do? Hummingbird flies to the water, he grabs as much water as he can in his small little beak, and he takes that and he puts that on the fire. And he does this back and forth until he's exhausted. Nana Bojo, or our creator, he's witnessing what's happening. And he says, hummingbird, for the work that you're doing, I'm going to give you the gift of speed. And so hummingbird now has the gift of speed, and he's going back and forth, and you can hardly see him fly by. To me, that is a great story, an example of success and how our small steps can have huge impacts. Redefining, you know, this word rich and how we perceive richness. You know, when we talk about people being rich and being rich in money, that's only for a select few. But what if we saw richness as clean water and clean air? You know, that's something we all get to experience.
So in terms of rethinking success and rethinking what knowledge can look like in these knowledge systems, I mean, is this becoming more of a theater of a conflict then, in terms of having to deal with Western scientists and trying to get these ideas across? Or are y'all saying that there is more ready adoption of ideas outside of just sort of the selective TEK sets that folks are coming from? And Chrissy, I see you nodding. Maybe you can take this.
Well, first and foremost, we have to challenge the systems that exist, that have defined and have placed value on things, right? I mean, we as Indigenous people, we don't think in dollars and cents, right? We don't place a dollar value on our land because it is our existence, right? It's our survival. We're a part of that. But today I had the honor of listening to a panelist of economists thinking about loss and damage, thinking about climate finance, thinking about all these things. And what was stark starkly missing from all of that was Indigenous peoples' lands and the protection of Indigenous peoples' lands. And, you know, I really want to say here that we ask the wrong questions. Indigenous peoples don't want your money. We don't want your finance. We don't want your climate finance. We want security of our land tenure because we have proven that we can live in a balanced way on our lands. And this comes from the wisdoms and the knowledge that we have. So we have to deconstruct these systems of hierarchies that exist that place value on the wrong things. Just following up from Tia, we place value on objects. For example, in this world, you go to, you know, an antique store, and you place value on a material piece of antique, and you value that. These are the social constructs that we live in right now. We need to deconstruct that and place value where Indigenous peoples have put value, and that is on Mother Earth. That is on the relationship that we have with each other. That is on the interconnectedness that we have with our natural world. And that is seeing ourselves not as a higher being, but seeing ourselves as a part of. In my language, we say, we are children of the earth. We are part of the earth. And so it's important for us to really decolonize and deconstruct all these systems that have placed value on our knowledge, that say it is less than science. Well, I come from a civilization that's one of the oldest civilizations of the world, the Maya civilization. And we contributed so much to mathematics, to astrology, to all these areas of science. Yet the narrative that is told of my people is that that civilization collapsed, that we no longer exist. And here I am sitting here thinking, we still have those wisdoms, we still have those knowledge, and we're still here in the here and now. And I think that that is why we have to deconstruct not just those systems, but also the narratives that speak about Indigenous people's knowledge.
And Robin, perhaps to you to build on this a little bit, when we're thinking about a more holistic, even adoption of traditional ecological knowledge practices, I mean, is that adoption of a more holistic view more or less at odds with capitalism?
It is certainly at odds with extractive market capitalism, no question. And I endorse this call for real systemic change, right? That the ways that we're talking about adapting and changing our pathways means that we have to change those fundamental things as well. You know, one of the things that this leads me to think about is the role of thinking about technology, for example, in climate adaptation, without thinking about these social constructs and these values. I'm reminded, I don't remember who it was who shared this story with me, but we were talking about Indigenous architecture, for example, in the realm of energy conservation, certainly an important element of climate resilience, no? And the observation was made, again, and pardon me, maybe somebody knows this story better than I, but the fragments of it that I'm remembering are that the question was all about how Indigenous architecture, our wigwams, our bark lodges, could be so warm in the winter. And I live in a very cold, snowy sort of place. And the observation was made that our people noticed that they stayed warm in the winter in our cozy bark lodges because we built a small fire and sat close to it. And it was said that they observed that the settlers built a big fire, really big fire, at a big house, and sat far away from the fire. And that small observation to me contains so much wisdom relevant to this question of how we satisfy our needs by market capitalism, by other sorts of economic systems, the gift economy, the economy of abundance rather than scarcity. That little story of saying that, we don't have to change all of our technologies, we have to change our own behaviors and value, again, that notion that we could sit close to the fire. We could adapt our architecture, our traditional technologies in ways that are grounded in a completely different value system of not having so much, but of having what we need and using it well. I hope that addresses your question.
Michael, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's really missing, even from the conversation, is just the fact that we're here. Recognition, you have to have recognition before you have equity. I really believe that. Right now, we're recognized by being a museum piece, wearing a loincloth and feathers in a museum in black and white. And we're still struggling with that. We're still struggling to try to understand the public that we still wear feathers, but, maybe not as many. And I certainly don't want to see myself in a loincloth anywhere, any place like that, but it might be something might differ on that. But, it's just that type of approach. But, it's really about, what everybody's still saying. It's just about placing the values on things. Even in architecture, for example, this is something simple, is that when I was building my home at Hopi in the traditional fashion using sandstone, I was up there and I put seeds. A gentleman came up and said, put seeds in your plaster and put them on the walls when you're plastering your walls. And I thought the guy was crazy, but then I did that. He came back and I said, why did you ask me to do that? He says, because when we were having droughts a long time ago in the same conditions we're having today, we did that to remind us that we have food in the house. We can't eat it, but what's there. See the beauty in that? Our systems are built to adapt not only the environmental shocks, but also the psychological shocks that come from being indigenous. That's what makes our systems complete. It's that understanding that not everything is fashioned in a way where material is first, like she was saying. It's how we feel and who we are and how we uphold our community that comes first, right? And so by relaying that story, it's a feel-good story, but it's more important than that, because a story is not necessarily some sort of like Pluto and Mickey Mouse kind of stuff. It's about trying to invoke the discipline that we all need and the understanding that we all need to continue our way of life, right? And so that's something I feel like we need to really work on here in greater America is that sort of discipline maybe and stuff like that. But I'm kind of a philosopher, but that's okay. I'm here. So. But other than that, I'm done with that. Thank you.
Everyone here has shared some really incredible stories and wisdom. And I guess one of the questions I think of here is, are you concerned, and we've touched on this already, are you concerned that essentially the mining of those ideas and wisdom will more or less give people an excuse to forget about us while taking our ideas, our notions, and our stories?
Absolutely. I think, the system, I go back to the systems that we live on. In fact, neocolonialism is the new system of colonialism where it's always a way to make us invisible. So mining our knowledge is a way to make us invisible. Doing so without taking into account our value systems is a way to make us invisible. And so just building off the engineering story, right? I listened to the keynote speaker yesterday, I believe, Sheila Watt-Coulter, who talked about how they have learned to build ice houses that keep them warm. And here again, we learn of a different kind of engineering. Where I come from, we use the Cahoon palm to build our homes. And so, but who sees us as engineers? We don't have degrees that say we're engineers, right? But we are the only ones who carry this knowledge. And in this knowledge, if you just see it as a science, you're missing the whole point, right? Because in the way that we build our homes, there is an economy that exists. And there's this economy of reciprocity that exists. So for example, you don't have to have $1 in your pocket to have a home in my community. What you have to have is investments in what I like to call the favor bank, right? You have to have enough friends and enough family. You have to have had invested in building other people's homes in order for them to come and help you to build your home. And just today, because this is such a natural instinct for Indigenous peoples, today, my brother over here gifted me a beautiful blue corn. And, I have to tell you this story because that's the way we transmit knowledge. This is just it's the evidence of our system of reciprocity. It was so instinctual, it was so easy to gift me his corn, right? And it is because that is our whole cosmovision is built upon this interconnectedness, this ability to connect with each other, to pass on, because we are a part of a whole. And I think that if you just take our knowledge for what it is, and you don't take the values, the interconnectedness, the relationships that come with that, then you are missing the whole point.
And I guess, Tia, in your work, when thinking about the mining of knowledge and story, I mean, what are some of the things that you're thinking about when you're thinking basically about protecting your community and your history?
Yeah, there's a lot that I think about. It comes back to this elder from Manitoba, David Christian and Ba. He talks a lot about Indigenous people's right to intellectual property rights and being able to protect our ancestral knowledge. Because our knowledge is meant to be shared, but unfortunately, in Western society, we have this problem with being very extractive and even abusive at times. Within Canada, we have a really bad history of non-Indigenous researchers coming into our communities, doing research and collecting data, and then leaving us hurt, abused in the process. In Canada, we have what's called residential schools, and so at these residential schools, they would forcibly take children from their communities, put them into these schools at such young ages where they couldn't speak their languages, they couldn't practice their culture, and 90 to 100% of them experience psychological, physical, or even sexual abuse. And then many people don't even know that people conducted research on the children that were at those schools, and that they restricted them from certain vitamins, some were malnourished and even died from starvation. And from this science and this research that they stole from, our bodies and our children, this is what led to the development of the Canadian Food Guide. And so we have to figure out how to share these teachings with the Western world in a way that is, it's not being utilized and extracted, but rather, it's grounded in the context of indigeneity, because they often take this process and they transform it into this hyper-individualism that ignores relationality, and it often does more harm than good. For another example, our sweat lodges, people, they take this information, and this is a really powerful tool that we can use for connection and healing. They take this information, they start charging people, and then people actually die in the process of doing this. So, we have to be really, really careful, because this information is powerful, but when not used in the right way, it can do a lot of harm.
Building on that with a question from the audience, for people in Indigenous communities, how can we most effectively engage with and communicate our knowledge to those in the science communities? Tia, do you want to start?
Yeah, this also kind of brings me back to another story. Sorry, I'm sharing all kinds of stories. That's just how it goes. Within my community, so I'm a Girl Rising Fellow, Future Rising, and I created a short documentary on the water crisis for First Nations communities. My community, we've been impacted by a sacrifice zone that's just upstream from us. So this pollution, they're still allowed to legally dump in our waters today. And it's affecting, our plants, our animals. It's more importantly affecting, our community and our people who are holding on to our knowledge and our culture. anyways, they come to us, and even though they're still continuing to pollute and they're still doing this harm, they come to us in the sake of truth and reconciliation in Canada, and they ask us to perform, water blessings or water ceremonies for their companies. And it's like, we have been doing that work, and we continue to do that work with or without you, I think really, we have to be very careful because, we need to be rooted in our values. And unfortunately, today, this capitalistic system, it's one that we live in. And I always try to tell people, we need to figure out how to manipulate this system to our advantage. And when I say our advantage, I mean all of us that want better for the earth. And we have to be so rooted in our values that when we learn how to play those games and we learn how to win, we use those winnings in a good way. And so it is, I say, be cautious and be alert when sharing that knowledge.
Robin, same question to you. Can you think of effective ways to communicate knowledge to folks in science communities?
Yeah, building off what's been said already is, I think that the protection of culturally specific knowledge is really important, and the sharing of that knowledge needs, of course, to be in the hands of our people and decision makers. But I want to differentiate between culturally specific knowledge, which is and should be, I think, held very closely within communities, and the application of scientific principles that our people have derived and practiced since time immemorial that can guide climate responses. An example of this might be, I think about the cultural value of thinking that our actions are not only on behalf of human people, of course, but on behalf of our more than human relatives. And an aspect of that we can share to perhaps guide some climate related solutions are things like assisted migration, what one of my really respected teachers, Henry Lickers, called helping forests walk. That it is our responsibility as human people who have been gifted by so much from the plants that we need to reciprocate with our gifts, particularly in this time when climate is changing so fast that our plant relatives can't move on their own. So the kinds of things that I would advocate sharing with the climate science community are these strategies of things like assisted migration, of the way in which our people participated in carrying our plant relatives around from place to place to new habitats as the environment changed. It's an exchange of gifts, our human gift of mobility and seed planting in return for the gifts of the plants. And those kinds of broad values coupled to action. So I think about something like assisted migration in the face of climate change as deeply guided by our values and also really pragmatic. Those kinds of sharing from Indigenous science and wisdom seem to be the appropriate pathways for sharing, as opposed to what is often asked for, which is really culturally specific information, which belongs to our people. And so I think we have this mutual process of discernment of what are the things that we can share to guide climate adaptation on behalf of our own people as well as our relatives, as opposed to the culturally specific knowledge which is within communities.
I mean, I guess building on this, when we're thinking, obviously thinking more holistically about the environment and our relationships with the environment and sharing this information with climate scientists or institutions. I mean, should there be some sort of holistic thinking on the institution's part to be looking at how allyship can include advocating for legislation for land tenure rights? Should it include other mechanisms that build on actual recognition of indigenous self-determination and sovereignty? Michael.
You know, that's a good question. You know, because we look at things different, and sometimes they're very similar. You know, I think, you know, at the University of Arizona, I'm trying to convince the research department that we should have an institutional review board process for seeds. You know, that they should be given the same credence and same value as human subjects. You know, it may slow down the process a little bit, but darn, it sure strikes a point home. You know, and I think that's important. I think, you know, when you look at just the rights of indigenous people, you know, we can frame that so that the people can understand, like an amicus brief, for example. If you write an amicus brief on private property, you frame it in the language that the people who came up with the laws with, then, oh yeah, they understand it. Makes a lot of sense, that, right? But it's not so much about, you know, trying to get up on somebody, but it's more about trying to build a relationship with somebody so they can understand where you're coming from. You know, a lot of this country and a lot of policies that came out of the United States, at least here and in other places, they were all built on fear and hatred. We don't know what they're doing out there, but they're doing something. So we got to have a law that stops them from doing that, right? And so we need to figure out ways to change that in some aspect. And I'm a dreamer. You know, like, for example, seeds are the most well-protected things here in the United States by the seed companies, the Plant Variety Protection Act. But I'm starting to look at our seeds cultural patrimony under the Native American Gay Repatriation Act to give them some credence and some life in their own protection in their own way. I'm not one who tries to go out and stop research. I want to protect like the whole world, but I want to make sure that our value systems are respected, just like you know, and I want to make sure that we have a way that we can go from place A to B readily. You know, so it's just about trying to have people understand it at the level that they could only understand it on, which is kind of sad sometimes because, you know, it's hard for them to understand sometimes what relationships are really about unless you put it in a framework where they could really understand it. I hope that makes sense, you know. I would like to have you all come to my house sometime and help me build my house. I've got 16 rooms there, traditional home, you know, and look at the relationship that I have with that home, you know. And before I go out and quarry a rock, you know, I give something. I leave a prayer feather or a piece of pottery. So I'm not just taking, you know, and so it's that type of approach that I think that we could work with each other a little bit more. I'm not by no means an activist. You know, I have nothing wrong with activism. You know, I'm more of a, forgot the word that I'm trying to describe here, but I'm more of a friendly type of a person, but still knows his rights well enough and has a good education. You can't pull one over on me. And so that's the beauty of me. And so, you know, it's good to, and you know, and we kind of go talk about right now, and I think we all touched on that here, even Robin did so beautifully, is that some things are sacred to us, some things should be kept sacred with us, you know. And you know, recently the White House, on a follow-up, has passed a new set of guidelines that federal agencies can adopt, and they can adopt as many things as they want to. But you know, a lot of these traditional ecological knowledge is place-based. It's only going to work in one place. I can't take my cropping system and grow it in Iowa because it's not going to do well there. Right? And so, you know, we still have that. We still have our places, and I think that needs to be respected. But other than that, I'll just let it go. Thanks.
Well, and building on that, maybe, Christina, you can talk more about this as well. I mean, when we're thinking of, for instance, universities that have robust science programs that are looking to work with indigenous communities and, you know, trying to make sure that they're integrating, you know, TEK into their programming and whatnot. Many of these institutions still own or benefit land that are taken from indigenous people, or own land or resources in other parts of the world, you know, for science purposes and whatnot. So we're talking about actual institutions that benefit from colonialism and land theft, while still asking for help with traditional ecological knowledge. And if there's a way to square those two things and think about how allyship and can be expanded, I mean, how can we tackle that a little bit more with the institutions that we're working with?
I think that that is a very important question. But let's first tackle the root of the problem, right? The root of the problem, the reason why we're talking about this is because we don't trust each other. And why is it that we don't trust each other? We don't trust each other because of the structural power imbalances that have been created, right? We are always seen as the most illiterate, or we're seen as indigenous peoples are always viewed from the lens of, or they're living in a time of the past, or they're the poorest of the poor. We have all these labels, right, on us. We're not being labeled in the same way as the scientific institutions that you talk about. So how do we fix that? How do we regain that trust? And there's fundamentally one way, all right? We got to turn the table upside down, so to speak. I mean, one of the ways in which we are pursuing really shifting that power imbalance is to use the very tools that have been used against us. And you think about the law, right? The law is a colonial tool that has subjugated indigenous people for countless generations. The Maya people in southern Belize took the law, and we said, you know what? We are going to go to the courts, not to prove to ourselves that we own and we steward these lands, right? But to prove to the rest of the world that your own tools can show and affirm that these lands belong to the Maya people of southern Belize. When we first took this to the courts, people laughed at us. Why was that the reaction? The reaction was because we were not lawyers. We didn't go to school to learn how to exercise this tool. But through allyship, through partnership, and real collaboration, not seeing us as beneficiaries, but seeing us as partners. We partnered with law students, lawyers from all over the world. Professor Anaya is here in our midst, has been with us for the last 30 years, litigating, using the very same colonial tools. And what that does is it puts us in the decision-making seat. Because right now, when we're talking about climate change, we're not in the decision-making seat, right? When you're asking about our traditional knowledge, you're not saying, come sit with me at a table so we can make decisions together. You're saying, tell me what you know so I can use it, right? And so you have to shift that power imbalance. And you have to go to the root of what causes that mistrust. And that is what it is. And so what do? We take our research and you go and allow indigenous peoples to determine what kinds of research needs to be done and where on their lands it needs to be done. Because I take one example. We have had many, I can't tell you how many academics come onto our lands to study us and to study our lands and to study our nature, and not very few of them come back to tell us what were their findings. I mean, as simple as that, right? But on top of that, we have had so much attacks from particularly conservation organizations that talk about our milpa system of growing corn as destructive, as it burns down the forest, the slash and burn, even that term slash and burn, right, demonizes the way that we use the land. It's not different from what Sheila was saying when they see them slaughter the seal and they see the blood on the ice. The animal advocates come and say, oh, they're doing it all wrong. We got to stop them. But it's a lack of understanding. And so we need the science to prove our track record. For the last 25 years, we've been told that slash and burn is one of the biggest drivers of deforestation, right? You hear that rhetoric over and over. But if you were to bring academics to really study it, I think you would see the difference in the scientific data that proves where we live is still the most forested area, despite the fact that we've been practicing this way of milpa system for centuries, right? But unless you see the science, and because we value the science so much, we will only believe it if it says so. So what we've been telling you for years and years and years, you will not believe until the institutions that are respected and regarded, that are given value, actually repeat what we've already known for countless generations.
And maybe, Robin, too, I mean, does this speak to sort of a fundamental refusal to see indigenous peoples as people with rights, or and people that have that states have actual responsibilities to, or international human rights actually protect?
Well, it certainly can reflect that, but I don't think as a universal that's necessarily so. What seems to me to be most important in following up on this thread is the notion of the responsibilities that these scientific institutions have. Yes, to recognize land rights, absolutely. Rights to protection of knowledge, absolutely. Rights to self-determination, to food sovereignty, all of those things that we hold dear and will fight for. But the responsibility, I think, also it gets back to values. You know, in thinking about scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge, one of the, I think, major differences that create some of this distrust that has been so wisely identified is that in Western scientific practice, knowledge and responsibility for that knowledge are uncoupled. You know, this idea of knowledge for knowledge sake, this taking of knowledge without reciprocity, this taking of knowledge in this data mining kind of way, is because of this fundamental value difference that uncouples knowledge from responsibility. But what if, when we sit down at the table, and I think that's a major point, you know, it's not a matter of taking our knowledge, but sitting down together to say, what are the research questions? What are the things that will be of benefit to land and to people? And to have this responsibility for that knowledge inculcated in our scientific partners, so that, to follow up on one of the questions you were asking, is what's the role of university lands, for example, and thinking about land tenure. When I think about the considerable acreage that public universities have in the United States, and many of those lands, of course, were our indigenous homelands from which we were dispossessed, and the money associated with that dispossession and timber harvest, et cetera, went to fuel the land grant universities, right? Now, in this time, what are the reparations associated with that? Yes, land back, absolutely. And another kind of responsibility that's associated with those lands is, what if things like, ag experiment stations, experimental forests that are used to perpetuate colonial science, extractive science, I think there's a responsibility coupled to that knowledge so that universities can utilize their ill-gotten gains, if you will, to be demonstration and scientific landscapes that demonstrate or allow our people to demonstrate our indigenous science, so that we do have those studies guided by our own knowledge that the Western scientists will view as valid. But I think it's the responsibility of scientific institutions to create capacity and space in partnership for indigenous science to be manifest in decision making.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience that I think is probably suited for you, Michael. What would panelists suggest to non-Indigenous people practicing or striving for regenerative agriculture and soil revitalization?
You know, that's a question that I'm starting to get into, regenerative agriculture. I've heard so many, phrases here, looking at the soils, looking at the holistic way to manage our lands, which we basically didn't do a good job managing before, right? And so, But like I was saying earlier, it's still based upon looking at the principles and processes. I mean, not the principles, but the practices and the processes of what makes regenerative agriculture regenerative. You know, I mean, we're also now starting to, use the term regenerative agriculture. We're saying, giving back in a way, well, indigenous people have done this for thousands of years. We've done permaculture for thousands of years, and we're just going to be kind of like indigenous people. But you don't have the value system, and I think that's what's missing. That's the discussion that we're talking about when we talk about regenerative agriculture, is that there's this whole underlying value and cultural system that we have, at least at Hopi with our agricultural system, that there's no separation between our belief system and what we do as agriculturalists. They're all tied together, and so by doing that, you're able to maintain a healthy relationship with the environment that you live on. We only receive 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year at Hopi. That's it. But we're able to raise things like melon, squash, beans, corn. When I was at Cornell, they told me I needed 33 inches of annual rainfall to raise corn. And I said, man, you guys got some weak corn here. And so I said, we plant our corn down 2 feet deep. We only get 6 to 10 inches of rainfall a year, and it still comes up. But you know what makes it comes up? It's our faith and it's our belief system that makes that corn come up. So that when those corn just come up, they're like my little children. That's the kind of relationship and intimacy I have with the beautiful children that are on this cob right here. It's not a commodity, folks. It's life. We should always remember that wherever we go.
Other thoughts?
Well, a lot of times we have all these buzzwords, right? Regenerative agriculture and all these buzzwords, climate change, But I think the question is always, do you want the people with it, right? A friend of mine likes to say, the question is always asked, well, what do these indigenous people want? What do indigenous people want? They're always complaining about something. Well, that's a wrong question to ask, right? The right question would be, what does everybody else want from indigenous peoples, right? They want our lands. They want the wealth of biodiversity resources from our lands. They want our knowledge, right? But do they really want us, right? Because all these systems that exist and all these ways that exist, and even the new things that are coming on board, they're making us further and further invisible. I mean, you look at conservation and environmental conservation, right? A lot of times what it does is it grabs indigenous people's lands. And the latest assault to indigenous people's lands and territories is going to be not just water shortage, but also carbon credits. I listened today as folks talked about carbon concessions, right? Carbon concessions so that you can get paid for these carbon sinks. But what are the impacts on indigenous people's lands and territories? Where I come from in Belize, there have been land grabs. There have been conservation organizations that in the name of carbon concessions, in the name of response to climate change and creating climate actions, you have taken thousands and thousands of acres of Maya people's lands, right? Wouldn't the right thing to do is just to say, look, there are natural stewards of those lands. Those forests would not be there if we were not taking care of it for countless generations already. Wouldn't it be better to acknowledge indigenous people's rights to those lands and territories, to establish ways to protect them, to put in place mechanisms that would help them to continue to be a part of that land? Wouldn't that be a better and a more responsible way of responding to climate change? But this threatens the status quo. This threatens the hierarchical structures that I talk about, the power imbalances that exist, right? And so this is why it is so feared, it is so resisted. But I think that unless we are able to do that, we're not going to have a planet to live on tomorrow.
In terms of that idea of what people want, what the world wants from indigenous people, I mean, does this also render other actions invisible as well too, in terms of turning to or relying on traditional ecological knowledge as a fix to climate crisis, Does that allow decision makers to look at that as an alternative to actually cutting fossil fuel use, for instance? Is it a sort of PR Band-Aid to some degree from institutions?
It really is. I mean, you hear the rhetoric, right? You hear them saying all the right things. But when you look, if you dig deeper, it's only surface. You're not seeing the depth of their commitments, right? You're really not seeing it, because you go to indigenous territories and you see the same governments who are saying, you know what, we are going to do X, Y, and Z, or we've been doing this. And then you see them still denying indigenous people's rights to their lands and resources. You still see indigenous land rights defenders dying every day. You still see, indigenous people's lands being completely flooded, right? And nobody is really caring about the people that are there. So you hear these rhetorics, and it's extremely frustrating for indigenous peoples, right? Because we feel that it's not just a box to check off, right? So we're here, we exist in the here and now, and this is the time to make it right.
Other thoughts, Tia? What your thoughts?
Yeah, I think in Canada we talk a lot about this goal for 2030 and this just transition. And for us, it's like who's going to get left behind in that just transition? We don't even have access to clean water yet. How are we supposed to buy electric cars and put on solar panels on our reservations when we can't even get access to clean water and the power's always going out? So I think that's something that I'm mindful of often, and I'm thinking a lot about, capitalism and, that question, are we able to coexist? And, unfortunately, I don't know, I don't think so. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, because I've always been told, we don't sell our medicines. We're not supposed to make a living off Mother Earth. And when I learned how to pick winggush and gijik, those are our sacred medicines, sweetgrass and cedar, when I learned that there was a whole component of being in relation to Mother Earth and, building a relationship over time with that plant. When I learned how to grow tobacco, you're constantly putting your intentions in there, you're watering, you're nurturing that plant, you're speaking to that plant in a positive way. And Western science is just catching up to that. They're understanding now that, when you speak to water like this, it looks better than if you speak to it negatively. We've known that for thousands of years. I think we should really be taking the time to listen to indigenous peoples and their wisdoms so that we can start working together instead of, Western people being behind and trying to catch up. What if we just came together and imagined what we could do for the planet? This is in the ability to grow our medicines, that is all a form of indigenous knowledge, indigenous research, and understanding how to nurture and coexist with our ancestral lands and our territories. And that's based on reciprocity. And I think too, again, it comes back to that capitalism. I don't know if we can live on that framework, because I'm thinking about our white sage, another sacred medicine to many indigenous communities that's been overused, and become trendy in wellness culture, and now it's an endangered species. You can go on Amazon and find 50 bundles for $12. That's not medicine to me. I don't know. There's no intention. There's no relationship there. So I think, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of understanding and value indigenous peoples and their knowledge so that we can start working together.
In terms of your organizing practice, in terms of your work, what are the ways in which you're starting to build a lot of that community to really think about making those systemic changes at this time?
That's a great question. I think it always starts from a place of love. Even though I sound really frustrated and angry, my grandma always told me, the highest vibration we can feel as human beings is love. And so we constantly have to come from that place, from a heart-centered place, if we want to start building and mending these relationships. And I think as a youth, we want to envision a future, for as future ancestors. I look at my baby nephews now, they're learning their language, they're being raised on the land, and I'm thinking about the future that I want for them, these little guys. And I want a beautiful future for them where they're a part of society, where they're a part of this beautiful ecosystem that's thriving and flourishing. So what can I do today to make those systemic changes? And, it's not going to be by being angry at non-Indigenous folks. It's going to be by building relationships with them and learning from them while also they're learning from us. It's about maintaining that reciprocity. And I hope by constantly being able to come from that place of love, that's just going to trickle down and go everywhere and vibrate all across the world.
A question from the audience, and I'll throw it to you, Robin. What do you think about the IPCC recognizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge and climate justice to solve the climate crisis? And how do you make that strengthen Indigenous people's rights and prevent increased mining, knowledge, and colonization?
That's a pretty big question. Whew. The answer is, of course, that I don't really know, except the way that I would want to respond to that, I think, is sorry, I dropped out there, without having heard the other responses as well, is in what I would think about as our common future. That I worry about the kinds of divisions and polarity that arise around these issues, and to think about our common future, that all streams of knowledge are going to be needed to solve this incredibly complicated, values-laden, technology-laden, economics-laden crisis that we are facing. And it feels to me that pluralism and welcoming multiple perspectives and centering Indigenous knowledge in that is what will allow us to find our way through this labyrinth that's ahead of us. But I think the common ground that we all have is this desire to care for the beautiful home that we have. And that if we can bring people to the table with mutual respect, with real two-eyed seeing, to bring together both of these ways of knowing that are different from one another and yet can be complementary, to learn from one another, to shape and apply some of the scientific tools guided by Indigenous wisdom. To me, that's really what I would strive for, and that is what might lead us to a more balanced relationship with one another and with the land. So for me, it's not an and or. It's pluralism of as I remember being told so many times, of all roads are good when they're guided by love and respect.
Yeah.
And it's a very clappy crowd. I love it. And Michael, to you, building off of that as well too. I mean, earlier you generously offered the audience to come out to your home and see how
we'll see
how things are done. I mean, in terms of this is obviously a part of your practice as well too, in terms of building bridges.
Yeah, I think building bridges is probably the most important thing. I'm not one who likes to burn bridges, but I like to build bridges, and I think that could be just me sitting here talking to you, building bridges. When I was at Pepperdine, I read all the great works by Rousseau, Hobbes, Leviathan, Machiavelli. I suggested at that time maybe they should read Robin's book here, but I didn't get a chance. It wasn't written yet then, but it would have been a good one to put in there with all the other stuff that we read. But and so it's just getting to understand things, and I think you know, the bridges that I like to build are very inclusive. You know, they're very inclusive. They're inclusive for a reason, because I remember when my aunt was out there shelling the corn, I mean, not shelling the corn, but gathering the corn out there after he brought the harvest in. And there was this small little ears in there, didn't have that many kernels on them. And, you know, I was getting them and throwing them in the trash can. And boy, I got a good lesson on that one. And she says, no, she says, those are our most important ones, you know, because those are the ones that will feed us, and those are the ones that we can use again, you know. And it's that type of thing. It's that type of bridge. It's just trying to understand, you know, where I want to go to. And you know, I don't have to, you know, being an academic now, I don't have to, you know, change everything. You know, I have to learn how to do a reimbursement form, but other than that, I have to figure out, you know, how we can build the bridges of how I can build a bridge to just do that, right? And so it's just that kind of thing. And then, you know, when we talk about the security, especially food security, you know, food security is this. You know, this is what it's really about, guys. It's having this relationship. That's your food security. So you'll always have this. And so when I tell people like that, they really like, wow, I can understand that. So it's really about to build a bridge is to really understand what a bridge is about, right? And so I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, and just to build on that a little bit more, I mean, Christina, I mean, thinking about in terms of building bridges, I mean, and I think all of us here in sort of indigenous communities in more or less the global north are not facing the same levels of violence as our indigenous relations in other parts of the world. So while I really appreciate hearing building bridges and really thinking holistically about how we're going to work with other folks, I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts about where there can be protections when those bridges aren't working, or where we could really start thinking of areas to push back when some people are not interested in bridging anything or burning them.
I like that you put that question to me. Where I come from, I'm normally the non-diplomat. I tend to say things as they are and as I see them. But certainly, it's important to understand, and I go back to the teachings of the Zapatista people from Mexico, where what they imagine is a world where many worlds can exist. All right, nobody's knowledge is higher than the other. And I like just building off what has already been said, right? That we will need, all of us will need each other in this. And this is the whole basis of our value system, right? We're all interconnected. We're not islands in ourselves, right? We need each other. We need the technology of the modern world, but we also need the wisdoms, the sacred wisdoms of the indigenous world. And our wisdoms are not, we tend to think of indigenous people's knowledge as like one pool of it, right? Even that is diverse in and of itself, and we need all of it. We also need to recognize, I like to think about it this way, right? We're doing this for our children. When you talk to mothers, right? Any mother in this room will take a bullet for her child, right? We're in a human crisis, right? We're in this crisis together. And so we have to save it, protect it, stand for it for our children and our children's children. It's not even for us. And so when I think about that, and I think about, you know, the most famous movie in Southern Belize, the Titanic, right? Where at the last minute, when this ship is sinking, right? This really wealthy, handsome guy comes up and tries to pay somebody off to get one of those boats. Well, that is the one place where his money means nothing anymore, because we're in a human crisis, right? But he is still our brother in this crisis with us. And so we need each other. We need to take our responsibility to our children in a more serious way, for our children to trust us. Because right now, if I ask young people in this room, how many of you trust that your parents are going to do the right thing to ensure that you have a livable future? And for children, how many of you are going to hold our leaders accountable to ensure that they make the right decisions for your future? And so for me, I think that it's, yes, there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot to fix, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen. but there's also the possibility to think creatively and pool our imaginations together. In the Maya teachings of the Popol Vuh, when the gods were creating the earth, they joined their thoughts, their minds, they joined their spirits together. And in that silence, they created the earth. And this is what we're calling for: a collective effort, a collection of imaginings, a collection of ideas, a collection of practices, knowledge, and wisdom, bringing that together, because we're in the same storm together. We might not be in the same boats together, but we're in the same storm together, and we need to act collectively together.
So we're beginning to come close to the end of the panel here. I guess to start with pulling together some closing thoughts, I guess, as this is the Solutions Day. Michael, I'll start on your end. What does a holistic adoption of traditional ecological knowledge actually look like? Like, what does success really look like when you're thinking of the future?
I think, the biggest thing I judge success with in a holistic approach to anything is just how well is your community? How better off is your community? It's really about a community approach. I look at it from being holistic is, does this benefit your community? Not just the individual, but the community. And so I kind of just leave it at that, so yeah.
Tia?
Yeah, I think for me, we're still talking about harm reduction when we just need to stop the harm. It's time that we think about what it means to be uncomfortable and, learning to be comfortable with a new normal. There's still so much harm that's happening today, and we really need to challenge that. That's something that I'm, as a youth, constantly doing, is challenging that status quo that was set. Because it wasn't a good one to come into. So yeah, it's just time to stop the harm.
I want to challenge everybody in this room and everybody that has followed the summit for the last 3 days, right? What are you going to do when you go back home? Right here, right now. I mean, we're here, we're listening to a lot of diverse voices. This is Solutions Day. We're listening to a lot of ideas. But how do we not go back to business as usual, right? Not just on an individual level, but on challenging these systems that we talk about as a collective people, right? I think that is where, that's what we need to be thinking about as we leave today. Unfortunately, we're the last panel. But I think what needs to be fundamental for me is to underscore that there are existing balances right now on Indigenous people's lands. How do you ally with us to protect those existing balances, those existing stewardship practice, those existing connections to nature? I mean, you can come up with many different nature solutions, but Indigenous peoples are practicing it, they're living it, they're adapting as we speak. And so if one thing you take from here is, what did we learn from the pandemic? When the whole rest of the world shuts down, when the economy crashes, when borders are locked down, Indigenous people are resilient, they're self-sufficient, they're feeding their families, they're sheltering themselves. And so why don't we try to keep those lands intact where they are right now as the first solution?
And Robin, too.
You broke up there a little bit. Were you saying my name? I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yes,
But
yes, to you, and some thoughts on, in your opinion, what holistic adoption of traditional ecological knowledge looks like, and what success looks like in the future.
My greatest hope is for a kind of a cultural transformation away from this thinking of ourselves as these takers, to reimagining, not really even reimagining, but remembering ourselves as givers back to the land. And all of the technological solutions, the policy solutions that we know are out there, I think will fail unless we have this cultural transformation to remembering the land as sacred, and remembering that our responsibilities to all of life are sacred and should be at our highest priority to guide the technological, ecological, and policy solutions.
Well, again, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's been really fantastic to be. Sure.
I'm pretty sure there's a Indigenous center here at your school, so you can start building a relationship with those people.
I also think that, our ways of knowing and doing are not always written in black and white, right? They are in practice, they are in experience. I invite you, as Michael has, to, Indigenous people's lands, to Indigenous communities, immerse yourself, learn, and even for the institution, build in service learning projects, engaged learning projects in your programs so that you can expose your students to these things that we talk about that you won't read in every book, but you will read it on the land, you'll see it in our corn milpas, you'll see it in our rivers as we go down in our canoes. Do that, start there.
Yeah, and this year they asked me, would you like to have an alternative spring break at your house this year? And I said, yeah, I can always use the labor, But, and so it was good. So I'm bringing some kids. It'll be the first time the University of Arizona has done this. I want to use it as a pilot model, right? Because I think there's nothing better than coming to somebody's home. Being invited, of course, to come up there and see what's going on. And so that's kind of leave it at that. But, you can also read Robin's beautiful book. I'll put it out for that one. It's a beautiful piece of work there. Good, Robin.
What? Sure. What's the question? Gotcha. Thank you. The question was where can we find studies? I do believe that in this panel we've talked a little bit about where to the conflict between Western science and studies and indigenous practices. But again, I'm sure that working with local communities and spending time learning from them is one good way to go about starting that. So again, I know we're at the end of the time. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, thank our wonderful panelists that are here.
This concludes our Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit panel programming.
And please also
The University
give a
of
round of
Colorado
applause for
Boulder
our
thanks
translation and
you for
interpretation.
attending
They've been
and
working
tuning in.
very, very hard, and we really appreciate them, Ben.